So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay. And as it so often is with Silmarillion, given the frequency, I suppose, of the updates that it is given and the fact that I get given a replay basically wants to coincide with each of these significant updates, we're going to be looking at a new faction that has been added to the game today. And it's been the faction which has really been talked about the most in the Naugrim, or the Dwarves as they may be better known. And they've been talked about for a little while, actually. In fact, 3 whole factions in the Avari, the Dungortheb, and the Grey Elves of Mithrim have all snuck their way through the entirety of their development while the Dwarves have been being fiddled with and tweaked. But the Dwarves are here now, and we're going to be able to see them in action today for the first time. So hopefully as well, this is going to be the introduction, and I would imagine that given that Silmarillion has gone through another spate of updates, and that will probably continue to be the case as it continues to get updated, we'll maybe see a couple more Silmarillion replays over the course of the next month or so once again. There isn't really too much of a theme on this one. The only theme really is a meta one, because on the, not the blue team, but the purple team as it is in Silmarillion, the 3 newest factions to the game are going to be taking on 3 other factions. So Dungortheb, we have the Grey Elves of Mithrim, and of course the Naugrim themselves, who we shall look at first and foremost, because we're going to devote the most time to these. I always get a little bit nervous when I update Silmarillion as well, because it always breaks the main menu screen into being one of the old variants of Reforged, and I know that it's just an aesthetic thing and it can be added back in, but I always forget to do it initially, and it always makes me nervous that the version of the game is incorrect, but the replays always work just fine anyway. So, the Naugrim, the Dwarves of course are going to be a significantly more heavy duty faction than the 3 factions that have been added a little bit more recently, which are a little bit lighter in nature. A couple of them certainly more about guerrilla warfare, some monstrous units. The Grey Elves are maybe a little bit more of a finely balanced faction between their upfront might and their ranged support. But we all know what the Dwarves are going to be all about, and that is going to be having a significant amount more staying power and muscle in melee. That's going to be what they're all about. Silmarillion, of course, has got many factions which can take advantage of maybe the slightly slower nature of the Dwarves in some situations, but I'm sure that the Dwarves themselves are also going to have plenty of tools to answer that with. I'm sure we'll get onto that in a moment as well. We have the Miners of Naugrim here on the front, and of course they're going to be a little bit more of a basic Dwarven unit. And of course, Miners, we're used to them being the rank and file of the Dwarven units, the cheapest thing they have to offer, but they certainly look a little bit different, and they're certainly very impressive in terms of their model. Just in behind we have Iron Guardsmen of Balagost, and in behind them I think it's the Life Ward Pikemen, yes, of Ered Luin. So a combination of some pretty damaging looking line infantry combined with a polearm as well. Given what Silmarillion is, one of the things that we can always take some things away from simply looking at the unit here, but I'm not sure whether the, I mean they're going to be pikes, so this is actually going to be interesting to see how they form up in the meta compared to the only other faction in the game to have a higher tier pike unit in Falathrim, of course, with their bridge wards. But yes, the Life Ward Pikemen of Ered Luin are going to be a very effective tool for the Dwarves, because very few factions can field true pikes, and that of course is going to make their front lines very, very effective, because it gives them an anchor which few other factions can match. Many factions have got pole arms, but pikes of course have got that extra range which can make them so effective. Then we have some Iron Arbalists of Balagost. Another thing which very few factions have is crossbows. In fact, I think the only other one is Angband themselves. So the fact that the Dwarves have got a unit like this as well is a very unique thing. They've got a shield as well to help protect them a little bit from arrow fire. One thing that crossbows I've always had a bit of a problem with is their slow fire rate and their slightly lower range than the best archers in the game, which means they can be bullied in that sense. But ambushing the Dwarves when they have access to good quality crossbowmen like this is going to be a little bit more difficult, because you need to make the ambush stick. If you try and hit and run them, you're going to end up taking flurry after flurry of crossbow bolt fire, and that's not the sort of thing which many factions can withstand too much of. We shall see though. Over here we have the Life Ward Hewers of Ered Luin, certainly a very impressive looking axe unit here, 53 men in the unit, so this is obviously going to be one of their higher tier units in general. Yeah, and doubtless the Dwarves are going to have plenty of punch when it comes to their high tier infantry, as we have come to expect. But of course in Silmarillion's mechanics things are a little bit different perhaps, in terms of the intricacies. The High Thanes of Ered Luin here, 34 men in the unit. This is obviously going to be the best of the best when it comes to the Naugrim's infantry units. Obviously very impressive that they can wield such a large axe with only one hand, shielded as well, very intricate in their designs. Once again, it's going to be interesting to see how they perform in this kind of battle, because the Dwarves do need their elite infantry units to be of high quality, both in Reforged and here in Silmarillion. I think given the focus of the faction overall. They're going to need these units to do a lot of heavy lifting for them in individual battles, and hope they don't get picked apart as well, but doubtless we'll get to see them in action today. We have some Dragon Slayers of Azagal, so again an axe unit with the shields in there as well. It's going to be interesting to see all of these individual units in action today, just to get a better feel about what units are going to be good at doing what. We've got some Beast Hunters back here as well, who are a dual-wielding unit, a more entry-level dual-wielding unit, but we've seen these kinds of units be effective in Silmarillion in the past, so depending on what kind of unit they get involved with, again, they're going to be particularly vulnerable perhaps to being picked apart by missiles at range, given the dwarves' love of melee combat, but we shall see. More Life Ward Hewers are over here. We also have some Iron Legion Engineers, so some chariots. I don't know how people feel about the goats, given that Silmarillion is what it is, but I don't know, this is probably going to be the sort of thing which is maybe subject to change, but we've seen how chariots can be utilised in Medieval 2 in the past. They are a very high risk, high reward kind of thing. If they can keep moving and also utilise those crossbow bolts that they're going to be able to fire from the chariots' backs, they could be the sort of thing which can be a real game changer. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, chariots are very much going to be the sort of thing where keep them moving, they can do quite well for you, but it doesn't matter how many hit points you give them. If you get them bogged down, they're going to be burnt down pretty quickly just by their very nature. Then over here we have some halberdiers, so I think this marks the only faction in the game so far to have access to both a halberd and a pike unit. So that gives the dwarves potentially a lot of upfront staying power with two polearms, both for different things. Iron halberdiers in and amongst some more iron guardsmen. So very interested to see how all of this dwarven infantry does, because infantry is of course where you would imagine the dwarves are going to be at their very, very best. Got some more beast hunters and some halberdiers in here as well to support the middle ally, who is the one who, I think it was Lord of Balagos actually pointed me in the direction of this particular replay, but we're going to be watching it from the perspective of Arm Waffles, who's playing as the Grey Elves of Mithrim. Elders of the Twilight Hearth are of course a fantastic unit of archers. Mithrim in general are actually one of the more savage archer factions in the game. They may have a little bit of a lack of armour compared to a few of the other elven factions, but there's no doubting the damage and also the range on some of their archers. So the Elders of the Twilight Hearth being in the upper echelon of the Grey Elves archery units will let you know how strong they can be. Sentries of Mithrim back here, which are more of a basic spear unit for Mithrim. Very effective at holding the line, maybe not so much at dealing damage, depending on who they're up against, but that isn't really the idea behind them. Of course, they're going to be the first front line. They will immediately be joined by the Hewing Guildsmen of Androth, which every time we've seen Mithrim in action, actually, the Hewing Guildsmen have been very, very effective. Again, maybe a little bit lower survivability compared to the equivalent units from other factions, but their damage dealing capabilities are very, very high indeed. Mithrim also have access to some javelins in the Hunters of Mithrim here in support. They've also brought some artillery, which on an open field like this, which has got plenty of obstacles, can be a really good idea because you can shift the enemy armies around to your liking a little bit more. A few sword bearers, which are of course the swordsman version of the spearmen that are in front. They're going to be a little bit better at tangling with infantry, but of course a little bit more vulnerable to any fast movers that may be on the field. Tunnel runners, actually quite similar to the beast hunters we saw from the Naugrim, albeit a little bit more of an extreme version of that, because they are going to be doubtlessly more fragile, but certainly very savage if they can get into melee, but timing is going to be everything with a unit such as that. We'll get onto the units in the far back in just a moment. Got another unit of tunnel runners. This is actually going to be the most comprehensive look of the Mithrim cavalry, I think, because it's the first time we're going to see the bannerets of the Hither Shore on my channel, which is the stronger variant of cavalry that Mithrim have to offer. I think in the past we've only seen their javelin cavalry in action, so seeing something like this is going to be interesting, given that this is a more open map. There's obstacles to be wary of, namely the bodies of water in the middle, but cavalry can be such a devastating tool in the right hands, and with shore riders backing them up as well, it's going to be more difficult for enemy cavalry to overwhelm them. And then here in the back, hidden under the trees, we have yet more fast movers from Mithrim, another unit of shore riders ready to move forward and reinforce in the late game. In fact, I think that might be 2 units given the amount of horsemen that are there. Now then, the final army over on this side, we have nothing over there by the looks of things. There are hidden units over here. We have the Horrors of Dungortheb, Karangui Hunters, which are a Spider Rider unit, Duso-Manuthan Beast Hunters, which is the Javelin variant of the Duso-Manuthan units, which is sort of the main line of Dungortheb. Devourers of Children is a rather gruesome name, and when you look at them, I mean, this is the sort of thing that Tolkien probably had in mind, to be honest with you, when he was describing some of these creatures, because they almost look like kind of twisted fairy tale creatures. which, given Tolkien's initial workings in the Lord of the Rings world, does make a certain amount of sense. They are a very tanky unit in comparison to a lot of the other Dungortheb units. They're kind of like tanky trolls in the same way that the tree units for the Avari are. They don't necessarily do as much damage, but they stick around for quite a while, considering the kind of units that they are. Dusomanoothan Skull Splitters, again another dual-wielding unit. Plenty of good targets for archers for the red team to go after here potentially. Another unit of Devourers over there. Dusomanoothan Predators. Actually, this is the Javelin unit, so the other one must be the Axe Thrower unit, the hidden version. And then back here we have the Karangwi Bloodgorgers, which I think is the bodyguard tier version of their Spider Rider units. I don't know if we're going to be able to see anything else. Of course, this is the thing with Dungortheb, so much of their units can hide because they're really about that guerrilla warfare thing. Dusomanoothan Hunting Pack. I guess we'll see them as the battle rages on. Moving on to the red team then. We shall start off over here with the Falathrim, a personal favourite of mine, both in terms of the theme of the faction and their style. They've got a very much a combined arms focus as far as their faction goes. They have access to some really heavy Noldor units, which Marksman of Balar should be really good actually in these kind of matchups, because there isn't really much the opposition can do about them. Naugrim can maybe close the gap quickly, but over on this side of things, dealing with the more lightly armoured remnants of the Mithrim and Dungortheb armies is going to be exactly the sort of thing which a heavy unit of Noldor archers is going to be very good at. Marines of Brithombar are here to offer some javelin support as well, so plenty of ranged power. The Iran Lim are a really strong unit of heavy Noldor infantry as well, fantastic at holding the line, and there's really nothing in terms of survivability that Dungortheb or Mithrim have that can match something like the Iran Lim, outside of individual units that Dungortheb have that are monsters, but of course they're substantially smaller in terms of numbers. Nobles of Balar are a two-handed spear unit. The difference we mentioned earlier on, pikes have added range in comparison to something like the Nobles of Balar, so if they do find themselves battling the Life Wards one-on-one, they will probably get bullied. But outside of that, they do make for a very, very effective anchor to the Falathrim front line. Marines of Eglarest and Brithombar once again. Another unit of Nobles of Balar. The Mariners of Erendil being a morale battery and a strong unit of medium infantry. More Eglarest units, the Standard Warriors, and more of the Marines. There's also an artillery piece over here, so both sides are going to be contesting the artillery game with one another. Another unit of Marksmen of Balar, and then over here we have Valinor, who's played by Farkin. A few units of Shoal Hunters. We've seen them be very effective for Valinor in the past. They don't have the highest base damage, but very savage in terms of the armour piercing damage they can deal, both in melee and at range. Mariners of Alcolonde are javelins. We have some Grieving Sons, which are the best unit of Teleri that Valinor can field. The rest of their army going to be heading over here perhaps. This is more of the serious units really of Valinor, which are going to be joining up with the Avari. Some Plaza Guardians, another unit of two-handed spears, albeit they're also armour piercing, so another fantastic unit of polearms here. A couple of units of Sentinels of Tyrion as well, and multiple HP heavy swordsmen, and this is the first time we've got to see the Adepts of Tulkas on my channel. We've only ever seen the Kinsmen of Ingwe up until this point, and of course the main difference that you can see between the two units is that the Adepts here have a mace, so they are going to be effectively the armour-piercing version in melee, and that is a very good choice given that the Naugrim are on the field, and that is exactly why they're going to be heading over here. And the Avari are going to need a little bit of support from Valinor, because if it comes down to a contest of brute strength, there's no chance they're going to be able to defeat the Dwarves, but this is also going to be a good litmus test of how well the Dwarves can stand up to a faction which is all about that guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run style. There's some Bow Wards of the Darkling Woods that we can see. There's also the Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, which as far as an artillery piece goes can also make the Dwarves' life a little bit more difficult on the advance, but fortunately for the Dwarves they do have this little hillock in the way. The rest of the Avari army, however, is hidden, which of course is not too surprising given the fact that they are all about this kind of warfare, as I said. But yes, I think without further ado, let's get the show on the road, because this is likely to be a fairly violent fight given that it's only 18k frames and there is presumably going to be a little period of transiting across the map, so there's going to be no messing around from both sides here, which I do like to see. Let's see how the situation develops. So I would imagine what we're going to see here is actually, despite the fact that this is going to be perhaps the introductory fight, it's one of a couple actually that I've been given from the Naugrim. This probably will be the first one though, because I think this is the first in terms of just an outright field battle. But I would imagine we're going to see the Naugrim wait a little bit before they move in, because obviously you know the Avari are going to be occupying the wooded territory over there. So it's actually quite likely that we'll see the centre of the battlefield, including these bodies of water, come into play first and foremost. And indeed, the artillery bombardments that are going to be traded back and forth between both sides are going to begin. Interestingly enough, still, the sound effects for the artillery are not in the game. You can hear every other sound effect, but the dull thud of the artillery as actually hits in terms of flaming shot is still not here just yet. But yes, the Falathrim and the Grey Elves are going to be trading back and forth with artillery. I mean, you can see here that one of the Falathrim catapults has already fallen away. The potential prize, of course, of hitting some of the Mithrim infantry may be too much of a thing to ignore for the Falathrim. Honestly, it's kind of off-putting having the artillery not have its sound effects, but here we can see the chariots are going to move forward. They are fast movers, especially among the Dwarven army, which is naturally going to be significantly lighter in terms of its manoeuvrability. Valinor are going to be moving forward with the Avari spears to help block the advance of the chariots, though I would almost guarantee that most of the Avari army is hidden in and amongst that tree line over there. So while the Naugrim are moving forward, the main body of the Avari army will reveal itself eventually. You can see here actually that the crossbows ripping through the Plaza Guardians of Valinor quite nicely there, and the Plaza Guardians are a unit which can ill afford to be lost cheaply. Valinor's army is rather small at the best of times, and the Plaza Guardians make for a fantastic frontline combatant, especially against armoured units such as those that the Naugrim traffic in. Some of the Naugrim units are still pushing forwards. Still here in the middle though, we are seeing much the same kind of thing. Dungortheb, of course, are another thing to bear in mind. Both of the two factions have got, in essence, a single entity artillery piece in the Grandfather and the Hungering Moor over here, which is going to worry the Falathrim line just a little bit. They needs to be careful not to get this giant green spider too close to the Falathrim lines, because if it does get caught up in and amongst the entirety of the Falathrim army and the Valinor army, which is just in behind it, it's not going to stand too much of a chance in terms of its own ability to fight back against those kind of odds. Again, it looks like more of a splinter force over here, to be honest with you, with the Adepts of Tulkas over here. What do we have yonder? Some dead cavalry chasing down the Iron Legion engineers, and I mean the Scouts of Eglarest of the Falathrim are melee cavalry, so they will do quite nicely in melee against the chariots if they can bog them down. Indeed, they did manage to kill off one of them. They will wither under that sort of crossbow fire if it lasts too long, however. Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth also moving forward, but so far it's more a case of an advance towards the enemy which is being broken up in both, on behalf of both teams really. The Avari are always going to handle matters in this way, and I guess it is kind of incumbent on the Naugrim as they move forward here to be the aggressors, because the Avari are never going to be foolish enough to try and take the dwarves in a straight up battle of longevity. Wow. Still hidden units over here, which is kind of interesting. Dungortheb's main army moving over to help reinforce the middle alongside the entirety of Mithrim, and a few units from Ered Luim as well. Falathrim forming up. So I was actually wrong. It does look as though the Naugrim are going to be the first ones into full-scale battle. The armies in the middle not too keen on breaking ranks just yet, as the main Dwarven army does move forward. The exact position of the Avari, of course, is in question, and it could be that Belagost over here is trying to use his cavalry in more of a sacrificial sense to try and coax the dwarves just a little bit further forward than they would ideally like to be as a result of the cavalry charges in and out. I mean, they are melee cavalry at the end of the day, so it's not going to be quite as devastating as it would be if it were some lance cavalry, but the Beast Hunters taking a bit of damage here, but not too much actually. Their melee defense and their overall survivability able to mitigate the charge of sword cavalry such as this for the most part, and of course in melee very numerous infantry like this is going to be able to deal with basic sword cav like that. It's a problem sword cavalry has always had really in all Total War games. I remember being particularly disappointed by the katana cavalry back in Shogun 2 for that reason. They're supposed to be able to fight in melee, but of course the abundance of Yari Ashigaru made that completely impossible to make work. Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth does hit the Beast Hunters. It does make them shaken as well. I mean, when you're under this kind of pressure from a unit that scary. And these are basic units, at least in comparison to a lot of the other Naugrim units. I mean, clearly, what they want to make happen here is some of the units do now hove into view. Some of the main Avari units, the first refusers, who are going to be able to move forward with their slings. This is exactly the kind of unit which is going to be a bit of a bother to the Naugrim. Meanwhile, here in the middle, Mithrim moving forward with the Naugrim, just shoring up the flank to make sure that smaller force over on the other side doesn't prove to be too much of a problem. I don't know who would win in a skirmish fight between the Elders of the Twilight Hearth and the Marksmen of Balar. I would assume the Marksmen of Balar because they've got better armour, I believe, and there's more of them. In terms of outright damage, though, and they are shielded as well, the Elders of the Twilight Hearth, so that is an interesting question. I mean, either way, I think in terms of the relative importance of the two units, this is definitely a fight that Falathrim will want to have, because this is exactly the function of the Marksmen of Balar, to stand and win skirmish fights such as this. But we're still seeing, I mean, for a relatively short battle, we're seeing a fairly cautious approach so far, as the Naugrim are here, Life Ward pikemen in position. I mean, this is just the presence of all these pikes and halberds is going to make their lives just a little bit more difficult. The first refusers using their own projectiles now, of course, which is more of a Nathatoon-esque projectile. It's not a perfect one-to-one in terms of what they were in base Medieval 2, but the same sort of thing is occurring here, and they are also causing a lot of morale problems. This probably would be more of a worry for the Naugrim if they weren't away from the enemy lines. If they were already engaged, this could prove to be a little bit worrying, but as it is, I'm not sure that will be the case. I mean, the problem that the Naugrim do have here is they are largely on their own. They do have a bit of cavalry support from Waffles now, but quality in melee against the Avari is not the problem, but with some Valinor support, this is a pretty potent combination if you allow the Avari to continue to rack up the damage on you. There isn't too much of a problem with the Naugrim approaching the battle in this way, hoping they can ride out the storm, as it were, but it does rely on their allies on the other side really taking the initiative, taking the fight to the enemy to a certain extent. Plaza Guardians moving backwards. We also have the Devourers over here from Dungortheb, so they're also here. Pretty good unit to send in first because of their survivability, and if they do come up against some of the less potent Avari forces, they should do just fine for themselves, and we'll get to see the Grey Elven cavalry contingents now, plenty of Javelin cavalry. The Thorncasters do reveal themselves, so the Grey Elves kind of bump into them more so than charge, but the Thorncasters are primarily a ranged unit after all, so this won't worry them too much. The Bow Wards are here, so now there's a little bit more clarity on what the Avari are doing, although to be honest with you, you always knew the Avari were going to be in the trees, so it's not really a surprise. It's just seeing exactly what they've got hidden over there. If they thought they could get away with just missile units, you could rapidly move forward with your own infantry, but if they have infantry, that's less of an option. Miners continuing to take damage. The Life Ward Hewers are over here. I mean, the Naugrim can't really afford to stick around here too much longer, I don't think. Yes, as the dwarves, they are going to be very resilient, but this is free damage that the Avari are able to do, essentially, and that will ultimately reduce the workload of the elite Valinor infantry. And while the Naugrim may be very, very impressive, when it comes to outright quality, no one will be able to go toe-to-toe with those across the sea. Now then. Still over here we're seeing a rather basic skirmish fight with the Marksmen of Balar continuing to trade, although it does look as though they actually haven't done all that much damage to the Elders of the Twilight Hearth. So perhaps I was wrong. I mean, the Elders of the Twilight Hearth, when you look at them, I mean, they're going to have some decent armour, you would suggest, but it is a little bit more tricky to puzzle through. Very used to cloaked elven archers such as this being a little bit lighter in terms of their abilities there. Now Dungortheb moving forward, maybe getting a little bit too close for comfort to the Marines of Brithombar's line here, and the Karangui Goreswarm, which is more or less the fodder of Dungortheb, taking the brunt of all of these javelins. And the Duso Manuthan and Beast Hunters here as well. I mean, these javelins from the Falathrim will be doing quite nicely. Meanwhile, looks like we are going to see the attack occur now. Let's actually go down to half speed and get really in and amongst this. The Naugrim will obviously prioritise their infantry to a certain extent, so this is really the ultimate test right from the off that we're seeing for them here. Sentinels of Tyrion going up against the High Thanes of Ered Luin, and they're going to be backed up by some Beast Hunters as well, maybe penetrating a bit too far into enemy lines here. I can't imagine this is going to work out all that well for them, and I must be honest, the Plaza Guardians over here haven't necessarily chosen the best of fights, I would suggest, given the fact that the Lifeward Pikemen can outrange them, and their own formation isn't exactly in the best of shape here. There are some Valinor cavalry, the Wild Riders of Orome. Moving forward, Beast Hunters, the Plaza Guardians are going to do just fine against these more depleted units, but with the Grey Elven Riders backing them up, I mean, the Adepts are over here, they'll do superbly 1-to-1 in melee, but it seems to be far from 1-to-1 at the moment. I think the ultimate fate of this fight is really going to depend on how well the fight in the trees goes between the Naugrim and these Avari units. I mean, when it comes down to melee, of course, the Naugrim are going to be pretty dominant, but the more of their missiles they can use, the more the Avari will be hoping to tip the scales in their favour. A little further back, the Halberdiers moving forward, not going to be quite so useful for their armour piercing as they could otherwise be against other foes, but they'll still do the job. Lifeward Pikemen, I mean, they'll do a lot of damage here to the Wild Riders, but the problem is they did take a charge when they weren't necessarily braced for it. They're taking a continued battering from the Thorncasters as well. We do have some units in behind enemy lines as well by the looks of things. I mean, the Shore Riders are going to be able to mop them up though, javelins crisscrossing back and forth. And then a little bit further forwards, Sentinels of Tyrion continuing to cause havoc here in the middle of the lines, and against the basic units they'll do just fine. But it's pretty chaotic over here, and I'm not sure, honestly, who that favours more. It's not exactly the kind of fight with their infantry focuses and their quality and their polearms that either Valinor or the Naugrim would traditionally want. I think it's really going to come down, actually, to who does the better supporting role here between the Avari and Mithrim. To a certain extent, Valinor can also handle their own support with some Wild Riders, but I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure the Naugrim started off on the best of footings here. The Devourers are in behind enemy lines, but they're getting cut down by the Gloom Hunters, and with their damage they will be able to chop their way through the Devourers quite nicely. So I think, to be honest with you, the purple team, who we're viewing from the perspective of, kind of need to be a little bit more worried about what's happening over there. If the Avari do their job, I think the red team will be able to be victorious over here, and maybe Mithrim, with his focus on microing his cavalry, has allowed his elders to get engaged in melee here by the warriors of Eglares moving forward from the Falathrim. And the Falathrim could also be mounting a simultaneous assault against Dungortheb, and Dungortheb's mainline units, their Duso Manuthan, are pretty damaging, but they themselves are not really the best at taking damage, and a unit like the Aran Kielim is going to be pretty ideal for cleaving their way through Duso Manuthans. The Skull Splitters are not armour piercing after all, so the Aran Kielim's heavy plate is going to be doing its job. Both of these two factions have got access to plenty of good javelins. Early on we saw the Falathrim making good use of them. Now we're seeing a little bit more of the Duso Manuthans tear their way into the Marines of Brythombar over here. Lots of dead Karangri Gorswarm. Aran Kielim moving forward. There's some more Falathrim back there, but it is almost entirely Falathrim this. Valinor do have their support, but I would imagine much of their efforts are focused on trying to bring down the Naugrim over here. Gloom Hunters doing pretty well against these isolated pockets of Naugrim, which were earlier fighting off against Valinor, and I think Valinor are doing pretty well here. Host of the Withered Ash. Again, another polearm unit, which are trying to do their best to contain the High Thanes. I mean, if the High Thanes get into swinging range, they're going to cleave their way through these spearmen, but these spears will be hoping to keep them at arm's length as best as they can. The Bannerets are here, charging into the Adepts of Tulkas, who are still very much alive. Despite absorbing a great deal of pressure, they've done really rather well for themselves, and I think the Dwarves will be rueing the fact that they allowed the Avari to whittle them down too much. A little bit too much loitering, I think, on the part of the Naugrim, which is a bit of a problem if you're playing as a rather slow faction, which the Dwarves are based on their relative lack of mobility compared to others. every move you make needs to be deliberate, and it was ultimately, intended or no by Captain Gervais, a deliberate move to basically park himself right in front of those Avari. And then a rather quick assault from Valinor, which looked fairly risky early on, but he was able to penetrate deep into the Dwarven lines, and I feel as though the Naugrim are going to fall away here. Not too dissimilar, actually, to the reveals of pretty much every faction we've seen from Silmarillion. The last three that we saw, I think all of their debuts ended in defeat, and even if the Naugrim's side do end up winning overall, they themselves, looks like they're going to suffer a defeat over there. Nobles of Balar fighting off against all of these Mithrim spears. Got the Warriors of Aglarest over here. They are actually losing against the Grey Elves now. Not enough numbers on the front line here for the Falathrim. Marines of Aglarest moving forward, blocking the passage of the sentries of Mithrim. So the Grey Elves look to be having a fairly decent run of it here on the front line, which, considering the amount of Noldor units that are over here, is not too bad. Not too shabby from them. Are the Falathrim going to be able to defeat Dungortheb in their totality? Spider Riders are in behind, offering a little bit of support, but charging into the front of the Falathrim lines where they are focusing their attention is not going to be as effective as getting in behind. And I think, yes indeed, we've got the Do So Manute and Hunting Pack that have now revealed themselves, which are effectively Warhounds. Going to be going around and trying to get some rear charges to help equalise the fight somewhat over here. There's still the Catapult, which is still operational, interestingly enough. I don't know if actually they're going to do more damage themselves than the enemy at this point, because I think they are having a decent time, at least against the Do So Manute and infantry, as you would expect. Oof, the Shoal Hunters there, using their slings to do some good damage to the Hunters and to the Karangwi Hunters. I was going to say, actually, Hunters of Mithrim and the Karangwi Hunters, both having similar names there. The Hungering Moor getting some point-blank volleys into the Mariners of Erendil. Not bad, not bad. Karangwi Hunters, not the best of charges there, but they're still going to cause some havoc on the front lines. Valinor's support is going to be very, very important for the Falathrim as they start to ratchet up the pressure with more and more of those Balar units, a little bit more support. But the Valinor support is waving off now, so that fight may yet turn around once again. What is going on over here? I mean, the Naugrim are still alive, and considering the odds they've been facing over here, that is... I mean, we've got to give that to them, obviously. As you would expect, their resilience is pretty impressive. Rangers of the Hidden Path going toe-to-toe with the Halberds, which is probably not going to be great for the Rangers, honestly. I mean, they are surrounding them, but it's still going to be pretty costly. But then, when it comes time to start engaging in melee, that's always where the Avari are going to suffer against the Dwarves. Shore Riders charging in. I mean, this Mithrim cavalry could still be a problem, honestly. This, in spite of the fact that it is going to be a victory over on this side for the red team, it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory, especially if this Grey Elven cavalry has anything to say about it. And I have to say, most of the elite Valinor units that were over here have perished. It's mostly Avari that are remaining. Is there anything left in the trees? Not really. Corpses, mostly. Yeah, you can see here Sentinels of Tyrion. Actually, Sentinels of Tyrion are going to struggle here because the Halberds are going to be able to hold them at arm's length. They're already bloodied to a certain extent, so that's going to go pretty nicely, you'd have to say, actually, for the Naugrim. Naugrim actually kind of winning in the trees, but again, not with much left to spare. Still the sounds of battle and hollering. Host of the Withered Ash finishing off what remains of the dwarves in the back lines. I'm not seeing the... here we are. The High Thanes are still alive themselves, as you would expect of the upper crust of the Naugrim roster. But yeah, it's only a matter of time before the Avari come over here. The Grey Elven cavalry is not the most resilient in terms of its defensive values either, so they're starting to fall away as well. The Falathrim continue their advance, but they're now going to run into the hewing guildsmen, and the damage on these guys is going to be more than enough to deal with some already battle-weary Falathrim units. The Grieving Sons are in here as well from Valinor. Spider Riders moving in. This is good news for the blue team overall. I mean, in spite of the fact that the offensive continues, I can't help but feel as though they may very well be running out of steam, at least to a certain extent. Marksmen of Balar, I mean, you can see over here that there are some fast movers running around, mopping up some of the stragglers. Do So Manute and Hunting Pack and the Hungering Moor killing off what remains of the catapult crew that the Falathrim have. Surprised they're still standing, to be honest. But the Nobles of Balar will be able to shore things up from that perspective. over yonder. Sentries of Mithrim, another rear charge here from the Duso Manuthan hunting pack. Proved to be yet a further issue, because they were gaining the upper hand over here with all of these Noldor, but even with just a couple of charges from basic units like these hounds, that could be enough to flick the balance of power back in favour of the Grey Elves that are holding the front line. These spears doing a good job, and yeah, morale starting to break among the more basic units. Shore Riders are back over here. There's only 5 bannerets remaining, which is the unit you'd want more of in this situation. You can get in behind enemy lines and really start wrecking some havoc. And in behind enemy lines as well over here, the Shoal Hunters, and give with one hand, take with the other, I suppose. As the Grey Elves may be doing okay in the middle, but these Hewing Guildsmen, which are such an impressive unit as we have seen, taking some pretty nasty damage from the Valinor Slingers. Hewing Guildsmen moving back over. There goes the Dwarven General at long last. The Avari finally look as though they're going to bring the Dwarves down. And what do they have left? I mean, there's some Plaza Guardians over here from Valinor. Mostly polearms, actually, which will be useful in the late game. Late game polearms, as I've said several times, very, very useful tool to have and make use of. The Naugrim are the first faction to fall in their introduction video. Maybe this will be the second one, maybe it will still be the first one. It kind of depends on if I have a trip away and need to schedule this a little bit sooner. Ideally, I'd like to show the Naugrim last a little bit longer in a fight for their debut. We got to see them resilient in a situation that was going to be a losing fight for them. And some of their units were able to perform very, very nicely as well, but ultimately the Avari and Valinor's strengths combined too much, even the Grey Elven cavalry support, ultimately not enough to turn the tide of that particular fight. These Warhounds were committed actually at a very good time by Stuart. I was wondering if he was leaving it a little bit too long to use them, but he deployed them at a good moment by the looks of things, and I do not believe things are going to end all that well for the red team over here. It just depends on when the Avari reinforcements arrive, but I'm not too sure. Elves of the Twilight Hearth are back. There's still a lot of these Hewing Guildsmen around, and like I said, a very damaging unit. Should be very good against the remaining Avari units. Shore Riders are over here trying to stop the rot a little bit. It's being caused by these hounds, and that should help reinforce their position here. Yeah, we're into this is a very exposed part of the map, and we're in the part of the battle now where not many units on the field are going to have thought to conceive or conserve their ammunition to such an extent. When the battle's as full-blooded as this, you need to utilise your resources quickly, or you may end up losing them. You may end up not being able to use that ammunition when you wanted to. Tunnel runners moving forward now. Marines of Aglaras routing. I don't think the Falathrim are going to be able to hold on as long as they would want. I mean, it's a double-edged sword here, because this Falathrim offensive probably would have been able to stick. It was actually making some good progress in terms of momentum, but it didn't have the Valinor backing of real quality infantry units, which would have allowed it to completely overrun Mithrim and Dungortheb over here. Mithrim, I should say, had those Hewing Guildsmen in reserve that whole time, and they were always able to commit them. They always had more to give, whereas the Falathrim were front-loading quite a lot. On the other hand, if Valinor didn't commit all their elite units over against the Naugrim, I really don't know if the Avari would have had the muscle to finish the dwarves off over on that side. We're getting into the point now. Battle of the Titans here, a kaiju fight between the Hungering Moor and the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth. There is a little bit of ammunition left. I mean, the Elves of the Twilight Hearth actually weren't using their ammunition earlier on, so I mean, with that kind of ammunition against stuff like Host of the Withered Ash, that's exactly the kind of thing that should be working wonders for you, and the reinforcements are a little bit stretched as well, perhaps in their haste to get over here, but the Avari don't really have too much of a choice but to do this. Over yonder, Shore Riders of Mithrim. Hewing Guildsmen getting ready to get back into the action as well. Mithrim heading over here, plenty of regular units, plenty of Hewing Guildsmen remain. I mean, this is a decent little force that the elves of Mithrim have. here in the late game with the Elves of the Twilight Hearth as well. I mean, in terms of numbers, the Avari don't have an insignificant force left. Indeed, in terms of quality, they don't. Still some Adepts of Tulkas hovering around as well, some significant Valinor units, but in terms of having a more complete army, you would back Mithrim here, especially with a little bit of support from what remains of their cavalry. It wasn't enough to help turn the tide for the dwarves, but it might still be enough to put this battle beyond all doubt in favour of, I keep calling them the blue team, they are of course the purple team in Silmarillion. Adepts of Tulkas, 6 of them, I mean they were very impressive. First time we've seen them on my channel at the very least, and pretty much an ideal matchup for them. Against the dwarves you always know you're going to be up against armour. Exactly the sort of unit that you'd bring against Feanor or Angband especially as well. Elves of the Twilight Hearth now out of ammunition, but they've got good quality in melee. And this should be the end of it, with more and more of the remnants of the Mithrim army arriving to the front line. Even with the kind of quality, the amount of pole arms they still have left, I don't think they're going to be able to put up a complete enough front line for that to be enough. As the reinforcements continue to arrive, the Grandfather falls in and amongst all of the Grey Elves, both infantry and cavalry. There's still some more spears back here as well, a decent amount of spears as well. And that layered defence, again, not lots of small layers that were easy to knock over for the Falathrim, but he conserved enough here, Mithrim, a sort of ablative armour-esque front line against the Falathrim. And the reinforcements he was able to commit was able to defeat them and is able to push his team over the edge, so big credit to Wattles for that. We are seeing this battle from his perspective as well, so we'll see what was truly effective for him and what wasn't. There's the Hungering Maw as well, in true spider fashion, rolling over and curling up its legs when it perishes. The first refusers are still alive. They were an impressive unit as well, doing a lot of damage to the dwarves as they dithered too long in the range of the Avari's throwing projectiles. This is probably one of the better fights we've seen of the Avari as well, to be honest with you, and against stiff opposition as well, against the kind of foe you would normally expect them to struggle with ultimately. Not so on this occasion though. In spite of their ambush being in a rather obvious place, they were still able to execute on it quite well. But Mithrim here will be victorious. The announcer agrees exactly. So there we have it. The new does defeat the old in terms of factions added to Silmarillion on this occasion. Interestingly enough, in spite of the fact that Mithrim were ultimately the ones to put their team over the line, they got the fewest kills, only by a little bit, but it's still worth remarking upon that both the Naugrim and Dungortheb against that Falathrim assault did go down swinging, and the damage they were able to inflict was enough that Mithrim's tactics ultimately ended up paying real dividends for their team. I think for the red team it was always going to be kind of interesting because it's 3 very different factions. You have one very focused around quality, you have one which is focused around guerrilla warfare and hit and run tactics. The Falathrim, kind of a mix of light and heavy units, combined arms as well, a very organised force. And also one that you can field a decent sized army with, because not all of your units are super expensive. While you do have those options, you also have more rank and file as well, which is good if you're an Elven faction to have that option at the very least. Not every Elven faction does have it. But yes, an interesting fight. I don't know really what the red team could have done differently in this situation, because the Avari needed to handle the Naugrim in the way they did, and ultimately it ended up going quite well for them. Elsewhere in the middle, I mean, I think because they were winning over on that side actually, the red team, it wasn't really incumbent on the red team to push forward. They didn't need to be super aggressive against Dungortheb and Mithrim. I know that momentum is a thing and you want to press the advantage across the whole field, but there is a case for saying that the Valinor units and obviously the Falathrim, who committed all those units forward, maybe should have waited a little bit. Lord of Belagos certainly reaped a bloody harvest in terms of the amount of kills he was able to acquire in that assault, but it ultimately wasn't enough to put his team over the edge and acquire victory. So I don't know, it's one of those things that maybe being a little bit more conservative would have paid dividends there, but we'll never know. In the end, it was a well-earned victory, I think a close enough victory for the purple team, as I'll refer to them as. Like I said, this may very well be the Naugrim's debut, to be honest, although I think in my inbox at the moment I do have a couple more replays that Balagost has sent me of the Naugrim. So we'll see. I mean, this one will be coming out at some point regardless, and it will be part of, I think, a trio of replays that are going to be including the new faction, one of which is a siege, one of which is a bridge battle, and this one, of course, is more of an open field battle, so we'll be able to see them in very different environments. And this, of course, is the least advantageous kind of terrain for dwarves, typically speaking, whereas fighting on bridges and fighting within settlements, both underground and above ground, is the bread and butter of any strong dwarven front line. So we shall see how they do in those environs as well. But yeah, big thank you to Balagost for linking this replay to me, and big thank you to Waffles for having the foresight as well to save it. But yes, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.